All the photos and documents in this movie and many similar files are available for your personal use. Contact me for details. A Brief Teegarden History by Tom Teegarden. I decided to record 3 brief histories regarding the Teegarden family. First, I think back to Mom and Dad and my grandparents, Robert Teegarden and Annabelle Lamprey, my great-grandparents, Enoch and Mary Teegarden, and often think how much more we'd like to know about their lives, their childhoods, their stories. There are so many questions to be asked, but alas, it's too late. So I hope to fill in a few of the answers to those questions that may arise in the future. And secondly, I want to document how the discovery of the Teegarden family tree came about. And finally, include a little information about the Teegarden family in Wyoming during the Depression years. That deserves a brief look also. But first, a reminder that you may want to pause the video at times if it goes too fast. Now for the early history. The book, The Descendants of Abraham Teegarden, contains the entire family history from the 1600s to the modern day. I won't detail much of that history, as they say it's in the book. But to greatly summarize, our story begins in the area of Solingen, Germany, with Christian Teegarden and his family. His son, Abraham, we'll call him Abraham the First, immigrated to America with his family in 1736 at the mature age of 47. He brought his wife, Anna Margaretha Albrecht, as you can see here, and 2 sons, Abraham II and Johann Wilhelm, who changed his name to William later on. They settled just north of Hagerstown, Maryland, on a farm that was called Teagarden's Delight. This Abraham I lived 17 years in Maryland and then moved with his family to southern Pennsylvania, and much of the Teegarden history in the future comes from that area. Abraham's eldest son, we'll call him Abraham II, was 18 when he arrived in America and became a prominent landowner both in Maryland and Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, he apparently settled in the 10 Mile Creek area, and his name appears on a number of deeds to tracts of land in that area, indicating that he was an early land trader and developer. He was also a sutler, active as a supplier of goods during various Indian battles and later the French and Indian War and the War for Independence. He served in the Revolutionary War and has this historical marker in Pennsylvania. The next generation included 2 brothers, George and William, who began to spell their names differently, T-E-A versus T-E-E. It is believed they anglicized the names to be more English-like after taking the oath of fidelity to the King of England, which they had to do. Our family belongs to the branch of William, that is, William of Wheeling Creek. You may remember that Abraham's brother Johann Wilhelm also came to America, anglicized his name to William, and became William of Westmoreland to keep them straight, but we're from William of Wheeling Creek. The original Teegarden spelling in German was connected with the word Teegarden, T-H-E-E-G-A-R-T-E-N, or Tiergarten. And a Tiergarten in German can mean a zoo or a park or wooded area. The most famous Tiergarten is a beautiful park in Berlin and was noted in many histories due to its beauty and central location, something probably like Central Park in New York City. In America, the spelling soon changed to several variations, with the T-E-A spelling the most common. So the lineage in America goes from Abraham the First to Abraham the Second to William in the earliest history. Then William goes to Samuel, then to Enoch Harvey, and then Robert A. Teegarden, and finally Otis Teegarden, my dad. 2 items to mention briefly. First, there were Teegardens who fought and died in the Civil War on both sides, and also in the Revolutionary War. Abraham II, for one, was no doubt acquainted with George Washington, George Rogers Clark, and Christopher Gist, who was a pioneer much like Daniel Boone. Here's an IOU from Abraham to George Mason, who was a Constitutional Convention delegate in Philadelphia in 1787. George Mason University is named after him. Secondly, because of this proven Revolutionary War lineage, any member of our family should be eligible for the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, or the SAR. But I digress. Many more details are in the book, so now we jump to the recent past. Finding the family connection. In 1963, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Air Force Base in Great Falls dispersed some fighter jets to Billings, so that if a missile strike hit Great Falls from Russia, it wouldn't wipe out our entire military capacity to respond. So a number of fighter jets and their support staff were stationed in Billings for a while, and a serviceman named Bill Teegarden was one of the Air Force men sent here. His wife, Loretta, was a substitute teacher in Billings, and when I heard about a Teegarden teacher, I called her and asked if we were possible relatives. We weren't able to make the family connection because of different spelling, but she introduced me to the Descendants book, and I purchased a copy. I immediately looked for my grandfather's name, Robert A. T.E.E. Garden. Our dad, Otis Teegarden, had always been told that the spelling was T-E-E and not T-E-A. Unfortunately, there was no Robert A. T.E.E. Garden in the book. There was a Robert A. T.E.A. Garden from West Virginia, but since my dad was born in Nebraska and had been adamant on the T-E-E spelling, I discounted the similarity, and that's how that stayed for a number of years. About all Dad knew about his father was that he had been a teacher in a little country school in Nebraska in 1888-89, and a strict one according to the book 3 Cheers for the Pioneers, a history of early Nebraska homesteaders. I inherited Dad's copy of that book, and that is what you see here. Dad was told that his father's name was Robert A. T.E.E. Garden, and as you can see, Dad especially noted that T-E-E spelling several places on this page that mentions his father. So because we were so sure of the T-E-E spelling, it seemed there was no family connection. Several years passed until one Sunday afternoon in 1969, I looked through the Descendants book again and was struck by the fact that there were several teachers and also that there was some musical talent in the descendants of West Virginia's Robert A. T.E.A. Garden, just as there was in our family. Well, that afternoon I was really struck with those similarities, so I picked up the phone and asked the operator for information for Hobson Enoch Teegarden, who was the son of Robert A. Teegarden and apparently still living. I got his mailing address, and that afternoon I wrote to him basically asking if there was a chance that his father might have been in Nebraska in the 1890s when my father was born. Here's a very rough draft of that first page. Hobb later said that when he received my letter, he was stunned because when he was a child, a cousin, Luster Yater, had told him that he had a half-brother living in Nebraska. And throughout Hobb's life, whenever he could, he tried to track down this supposed half-brother, albeit with no success. The town of Broken Bow, Nebraska was the only hint that Luster had given him, and when Hobb went through there on a trip west, he inquired about the birth and marriage records, but they told him a courthouse fire a long time ago had destroyed any records. So it was a dead end for him. And so it was that Hobb searched for his brother his entire life and had no success. And we know that Dad also tried to discover his family roots wherever he went, but neither of them was successful. Dad died in 1962, and so they never met. What would my dad have given for this photo? You notice any similarities? Anyhow, Hobb wrote me back. Here is a brief look at the first page of his letter, and we soon established without a doubt that Hobb and my dad were indeed half-brothers. Since those first letters, what we've learned is that Robert was not a healthy man. He died at age 41. And the doctors in West Virginia, his native state, told him to go to a dry climate. He went to Nebraska and filed for a homestead in 1885. In the next few years, he made a number of improvements: a 10 by 12 part dugout dwelling, a 12 by 18 log stable, a well, a fenced area of 15 acres, and had harvested several crops. And we know that he was a teacher in that little country school for 1 year, 88-89. But the fact is that Robert's health continued to be a problem, as the homestead papers show. He became ill with malarial fever and then later typhoid fever, and in the spring of 1889 he applied for a leave of absence and went back to West Virginia to recover. We don't know of his travels back and forth between West Virginia and Nebraska, but this deed indicates that he eventually proved up on the homestead in 1892, the same year Dad was born. And nor do we know when Robert returned to West Virginia, but it was probably in 1892 or soon thereafter. Dad was born in Bridgeport, Nebraska, and his mother was Annabelle Lamprey. We have no birth or marriage records, but if there were, the records were probably destroyed in the fire. After Robert returned to West Virginia, he married Winnie Phillips in 1901, and to that union Eva Florella, or Aunt Flo, and Hobson Enoch Teegarden were born. Incidentally, I didn't know whether to send that first letter to Hob or his sister Flo, and later Aunt Flo told us that if I'd sent that first letter to her, she would have just burned it, thinking it was some sort of a scam or something. Hob was the only living person in the world who had heard about his half-brother in Nebraska. So if I had sent that letter to Aunt Flo, we probably wouldn't have found our family's roots. Our first visit to West Virginia. The year after we discovered the family's roots, Betty, Donna, and I were eager to go east to meet our newly found relatives in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. A few highlights included driving up a holler one afternoon named Teegarden Run and seeing the old schoolhouse where Robert taught. A student named Lark Teegarden didn't like the teacher, our Robert Teegarden, and shot at him in the schoolroom with a .22 rifle, missed, and hit the blackboard instead. And we were able to walk around that old school, and, well, it was just a good old country school. We met an old man named Charlie Stoneking, who had been a student of our grandfather's. Charlie agreed that he was a very strict teacher, and Charlie also married a Teegarden girl. Robert Teegarden's parents were Enoch Harvey and Mary Seaman Teegarden, and we visited the farm where they raised their large family. It was pretty run down, and there was a family still living there, and they allowed us to look around. We saw the fireplace where Hobbs said he remembered as a child seeing Mary sitting in her rocking chair smoking her corncob pipe. We took pictures at the same place where Enoch and Mary's family had their family pictures taken in 1902. This is that same hillside from where those early photos were taken. We also visited Robert's farm on Fish Creek nearby, and we saw the little stream that Robert wrote about in the song Fish Creek Land. We enjoyed having Hob sing that song to us many times out here in the West. Hob remembered hoeing corn right here where this photo is taken, on the banks of Fish Creek, and where there is just forest today. Enoch, Mary, Robert, and other Teegardens are buried in the Shepherd Cemetery near Adeline, West Virginia. The little country church at the Shepherd Cemetery was in the beautiful West Virginia countryside. It was clean and a well-kept building, and the cemetery was obviously well taken care of. But the oldest Teegarden gravestones are in Ackley Cemetery in Pennsylvania. It isn't very far from the original Abraham Teegarden II area near the mouth of 10 Mile Creek, where it empties into the Monongahela River. This Abraham on this stone was born in 1775, and it was the oldest stone that we found. We had to search on top of a forested hilltop and watch for copperhead rattlesnakes, but we finally found the cemetery, although it was badly taken over by the forest by then. Since our visit, it's been cleaned up and it's kept up now. Our William is probably buried here also, but there is no stone. Incidentally, the Ackley-covered bridge from nearby here was regionally famous and taken to Michigan by Henry Ford to put in his museum there. They say that carved Teegarden names and initials are still visible in its timbers if you visit that museum someday. We found several remarkable similarities between Hob and my dad. They both loved a British-Canadian poet and writer, Robert W. Service, who was called the Bard of the Yukon. He wrote about the Klondike Gold Rush and attained popularity in the early 1900s with his poems of the far north. By the time of World War I, Robert Service lived in Paris, France, and Dad said later that he actually met Robert Service when Dad was in the army there. Both Dad and Hob memorized and read some of the same Robert W. Service poems to their children when they were growing up. Such poems as the cremation of Sam McGee and the shooting of Dan McGrew, and we were amazed one night in Sistersville, West Virginia, when Betty, Donna, and myself, along with Hob and his wife Ursula and Aunt Flo, were in a restaurant for dinner there on the Ohio River. We told them a little bit about our dad, and it was here that we discovered the poems connection, and we so enjoyed Hob, who at the table that night quoted from memory the cremation of Sam McGee completely. There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake LaBarge I cremated Sam McGee. It's a long poem, and Hob never knew the poem's connection before that night. The only other person that I think of that could have been able to quote that whole poem spontaneously like that might have been my dad if he had been there. I think there were a couple of wet cheeks between Donna, Betty, and myself. Both Dad and Hob had a way of nicknaming kids, and they were similar names in some cases. Gobbler and Fizzbang are the only two I can remember now. And Hob used some of the same phrases that I hadn't heard since childhood when Dad used the same ones. Here's just one example. The word anti-godlin or slaunchwise were words which meant going sort of crooked or diagonally. They both used the same words or phrases even though they grew up 1,000 miles apart. Another odd connection. Dad didn't care much for Jews in general, but he admired and respected a Jewish writer and columnist named Harry Golden. Mr. Golden was very intelligent and the publisher of the Carolina Israelite newspaper, which Dad subscribed to. He wrote a couple of popular books of short essays called For 2 Cents Plain and Only in America. Dad thought so much of those books that he bought about 8 copies or so of each and made sure that each of us kids had copies. I still have mine, of course. I have included a few of my favorite essays at the end of this, and I hope you'll take time to read at least a few of them. 2 of my favorites are Why I Never Ball Out a Waitress and The Show Must Go On. And oddly enough, Hob met Harry Golden in person and respected him as much as Dad did, and they had several stories about the greatness of Harry Golden. Mr. Golden was a brave civil rights leader in North Carolina when it wasn't popular to be a civil rights leader in the South. Google Harry Golden for more information. But what are the chances that these 2 men, Dad and Hob, from such a diverse background, would come to admire and respect the same poet, Robert Service, and have the same literary connection with the writer Harry Golden of all people? Not Steinbeck, not Hemingway, but Harry Golden. And when Dad died, his things included several copies of the newspaper, the Carolina Israelite. Here's what a couple copies look like. Aunt Flo, Hob and his wife Ursula and family, Paula, Phil, and Barbara, came to Montana several times and over time met almost all of Dad's Western family. We enjoyed them so much. They were fun people to be around. Hob could tell a story as well as my dad, and that is high praise. He loved to tell West Virginia hillbilly stories, and he made you want to roll on the floor laughing sometimes. Some of them are copied for you if you care to read them, but they are pale in comparison to listening to him tell those tales. Margie recorded a few songs with Phil that Hobbs sang along with them, and those recordings are available also. The daughters, Paula and Barbara, were wonderful singers throughout their lives, and Phil has been active in music all his life as well. You can see that music ran in that family too. Flo loved to travel, and she accompanied Marge and others from our family on several trips to Hawaii, Europe, and other places. She was a special guide and hostess to all those Montana Teegardens who traveled to Florida. Flo lived to be age 100, and she was a great lady in so many ways. We surely miss them all. One last point of clarity, I hope. As mentioned before, our name is spelled with T-E-E, as Dad had been told, but he was told incorrectly. His father was Robert T-E-A, and so Dad's name should be T-E-A, and thus our name should be T-E-A as well. And George T-E-E, you remember, he was the brother of William T-E-A, spelled his name with the double E, so it looks like we come from George's branch, but we don't. Our direct ancestor is William T-E-A. And what is even more confusing is that when they reprinted the Descendants book, they added our family and tried to correct the error and spelled our names with T-E-A. Well, that is not how you spell my name. And so if someday somebody looks for me or looks for my name, for example, Thomas T-E-E, they'll look in this book and they won't find me. They will find this Thomas T-E-A in that book, and then they'll probably make the same mistake that I made back in 1964. That is, they'll conclude that they're in the wrong branch of the family. And on that note, I end this segment of the Teegarden history. Finally, a bit about Dad's life and family in Wyoming. Back in Nebraska during the early years, Dad and his mother, Annabelle Lamprey, lived with her parents, Warren and Olive Lamprey, homesteaders also. In 1897, Annabelle married James Bowersock, and Sadie was born in 1899. Thus, Sadie was Dad's half-sister. Annabelle died in 1900 at the age of 31, while Dad was about 8 years old. He was then raised for a time by her parents, Warren and Olive Lamprey, then for a time by the owners of a little country store, and then by an Uncle William Prescott in Lincoln, Nebraska. So his childhood involved some moving around, to say the least. It's not clear what happened between Dad and the Lamprey family. Perhaps there was a conflict between Dad and the grandparents, or it might have been economic necessity. But the end result was that one day Warren Lamprey, the grandfather, just left my dad at a little country store. Grandpa Lamprey simply said that they weren't going to take him home anymore. Dad had to have been about age 8 or older. He was then taken in and more or less raised for a time by the store owners, Fred and Stella Gilman, and Dad always spoke very highly of them. We don't know how long he was there, and that's one of the many questions we'd like to know more about. He stayed in touch with Stella Gilman throughout his life, and I have 2 letters that Stella wrote to Dad later in life explaining what she remembered when he came to live with them. He then lived, probably for several years, in Lincoln, Nebraska with his Uncle William Harrison Prescott, Annabelle's brother. He was a Methodist minister and a music store owner there in Lincoln. We know that Dad worked in the music store, and also that he worked for Dun and Bradstreet as a messenger or something like that. And Uncle Prescott may have helped him go to business college in Beatrice, Nebraska, but we don't know anything more. At some point, he left to go out on his own, probably as a teenager. He played some semi-pro baseball and drifted around the country getting whatever work he could find. His sister Sadie told of his walking from Bridgeport to Redington, Nebraska to help with haying and getting 50 cents a day. It's about 10 or 12 miles one way. He rode the rails, as was common for poor people to travel in those days, so he might have been a hobo for a time. Then World War I, 1914-18, came along, and he served about a year in France, the last year of the war. We know very little of his war experiences, except that he has a medal and his dog tags, and he listed clerking as a vocation on his enlistment papers. Shortly before he came home in 1919, he wrote a good letter to his grandfather Lamprey, who was in a nursing home by this time. The friendliness of that letter does not suggest that the Lampreys had abandoned him earlier. In fact, on the 1908 census, when Dad was 16 years old, Warren Lamprey was listed as his guardian, so Dad may have returned home as late as then. Or maybe he was just kept on the books for census or tax purposes. We just don't know. Warren Lamprey, Dad's grandfather, was born in 1837 and a Civil War veteran. He was 73 years old when his wife, Olive Prescott Lamprey, died in 1911. This photo of the Lamprey family when Dad was a young boy shows his mother Annabelle in back, peeking over the shoulder of her father, Warren Lamprey. Olive Lamprey, Annabelle's mother, is on the left. Dad is in front, with Sadie, his half-sister, who was the baby, behind him in the arms of James Bowersock. Both the Lamprey and Prescott families were from New England, and both had rich family legacies and were prominent citizens there. In fact, a distant relative, Samuel Prescott, was one of Paul Revere's companions during Revere's famous ride in 1775. Yes, he really was. You can Google his name, Samuel Prescott. When Dad came home from World War I in 1919, we believe he spent some time in New York City and worked as a stagehand, perhaps at the New York Metropolitan Opera Company. My sister Mary Jane claimed that he met Alma Gluck, the great soprano of that day. However it came to be, he came to love classical music and at least some opera, and somewhere he learned to play the violin, more commonly called the fiddle out here in the West. All of Dad's 8 children remember having to sit still and be quiet, perhaps like this little girl, on Sunday afternoons when the Texaco Oil Company sponsored classical music concerts on the radio and included some opera. At the time, I thought it was pretty brutal to have to listen to that stuff, never suspecting when I matured I would also come to enjoy some classical music and even a little opera too. Dad was always a voracious reader. Somewhere he learned to appreciate literature, and he loved the classics, Shakespeare near the top. But he admired Robert W. Service, Mark Twain. He read to us Life on the Mississippi, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. He liked Charles Dickens, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes stories. Dad loved to read aloud, and I can still remember him reading Hamlet's soliloquy and the tears running down his cheeks. Dad met Mom in Sheridan, Wyoming soon after returning from France, and they were married in 1920. Our mom, Florence Schneider, was born in 1900, so she was 20 and Dad was 28 at the time. She was the daughter of German immigrants, Bertha Schroeder and John Schneider, who also married in 1887 and later homesteaded in Wyoming too. Dad and Mom began a homestead in Wyoming. This was probably their first home. The original homestead was not successful, and apparently they soon abandoned it. But in 1928, they homesteaded again at a different place nearer Mom's parents. This map shows that that place was about 6 miles from Osage and about 11 miles from Upton, Wyoming. It started with just one room, as you see here, although Dad added another room later. The house sat near the top of a slope where you might barely see Osage, about 6 miles in the distance across the barren plains. Not a tree in sight. The banked earth clods on the end of the house were to help insulate the floor. The slop jar, as we called it, is on the dirt clods and was the bathroom at night for the family, especially in the wintertime. The wash tubs are in the front of the house. You can see them there. There was no water there, they hauled water in cream cans from Mom's parents' homestead about 1 mile away where there was a windmill. This is where my 7 siblings were born and raised. I was the only one born in a hospital in Newcastle. Almost all the photos we have of the families in the 1930s were taken on this place. You can see how desolate and dry the place was, but kids being kids, apparently they didn't see it quite that way. These 2 photos show the wagon wheel that Dad set in the ground to make a merry-go-round, plus the teeter-totter that he rigged so that it rotated as well as being a teeter-totter. And in this photo, the background shows the root cellar that Dad dug himself to be used as both a tornado shelter and also a cooler place to store food on that hot Wyoming prairie. I'll share a few pictures now while I just talk about Dad and the family and what happened during those years. The 1920s weren't easy, but when the Great Depression hit, the 1930s were even worse, and particularly with families with lots of mouths to feed. With Mom and Dad, children came along about every 2 years from 1922 to 1940, 8 in all. Dad worked however and wherever he could. He sold McNess products, we know, which was sort of a traveling drugstore as we might classify it today. He worked for the Union Pacific Railroad building fences, and he also worked for Weston County inspecting and repairing bridges and culverts. And no doubt he worked a great deal by helping neighbors put up hay, harvest crops, and so on. I never heard many, if any, stories about the family going hungry, but I did hear about the scarcity and the limited foods available. It wasn't easy for either Dad or Mom. During the Depression, beans and flour were important staples that were great assets to parents and hungry kids. Mom baked bread several times a week, usually 4 to 6 loaves at a time. Betty told us of a snowy Christmas Eve, I believe, when she and Margie were quite young, and they watched for Dad to come home from Osage, and how they finally saw a tiny black dot against the snow that gradually grew in size until they knew it was Dad, who had a sack of beans about 40 or 50 pounds over his shoulder. So while they might not have gone hungry too often, we can be sure Mom had her hands full trying to make the beans, the pancakes, or whatever it was to feed that growing family. My brother Don wrote about one day when, as a little boy, he went to work with Dad to repair a culvert, and they had a rattlesnake experience. Don's memoirs tell of that incident, but I won't say more now. You can read it yourself. And I mentioned Don's memoirs just to also point out that there are many more stories from those days growing up on those treeless prairies of Wyoming in the autobiographies of Margie, Betty, as well as Don. And besides those memoirs, Bob and Jack also added stories about Christmas, the atom bomb, hunting, and more. You might find them interesting as well as educational. Somehow Dad managed to become a representative for a music company, and that was a great blessing. The company sent instruments to him to demonstrate and sell, so there were musical instruments in the home. He was an excellent harmonica player, and over time also obtained a guitar, a mandolin, banjo, and a violin that became so important to the family. Because for many years in the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s, there was a Teegarden band that played for country dances. Dad taught Margie and Betty how to harmonize even before they were in school, and the girls later sang at school graduations, Christmas programs, and other community functions. Margie once won $17 at a fiddler's contest when she was 16 or 17 years old, and $17 was a lot of money in those days. He taught Mom as well as the kids how to play musical instruments. The children learned when they were very young too. He was probably introduced to the violin while living in Lincoln with his music store owner and Uncle William Prescott, but where he learned enough to teach vocal harmonizing, to play the harmonica, the banjo, and so on, well, we just don't know. But learn he did because the family, including both Mom and Dad, and usually 3 or 4 kids played for country dances for many years throughout that part of Wyoming. Mom's older sister Elizabeth married Gene Watt, and they had 9 children. Their ages were almost the same as our family, and the cousins got along very well, so they had many great times growing up together. The Watts were hard-working people, fine folks, and stayed close friends with those Teegarden kids throughout their lives. Here is a photo from our family reunion in Bozeman in 1978 with all the Watt children along with our family. Note that Mom is in the center. The great change happened when Grandma Schneider passed away in 1937 and Grandpa moved to Upton. So our family was able to move from the little house on the homestead to the Schneider home where there was a windmill and a lot more room. Our family was living there when I was born in 1940, so this was my first home. We lived there until 1942 when Grandpa Schneider died and left everything to Mom's sister, Elizabeth. So Mom and Dad were forced to move. Dad found a farm near Roberts, Montana that spring, and we moved at that time. Everyone thought it was wonderful. It had trees and water, a little stream called Cottonwood Creek, and although the house was infested with bed bugs, the fences and outbuildings were in very poor condition. It was a welcome change from the past. The big log home had 3 bedrooms upstairs and 1 bedroom plus another room that served as a kitchen and living room downstairs. And while there was no electricity, there was a well and a country school only a couple miles away. So with water and trees and 360 acres of dryland farmland, there was a hope for the future. It was a wonderful change from the dry, barren Wyoming prairie. We lived there from 1942 to 1957, at which time Mom had a brain tumor and we had to sell the farm. Mom and Dad had been divorced in 1949, and we didn't see much of Dad after that until he moved back to Sheridan, Wyoming in his latter years. After the divorce, he lived in Roundup, Montana for a while, then in Arizona, and then in Florida for several years before returning to Sheridan, where he could be closer to family and friends. Over a very long time, he worked hard to educate himself and his family, but had unbelievable trials and tribulations, starting with that difficult childhood and then trying to put food on the table with that large family through the Great Depression years, some of the most difficult times in America's history. He and Mom believed in education and instilled in many of us a strong work ethic and a sense of honesty and responsibility. He passed on his love of music, reading, and literature to many of us that has endured through the years. He was very proud of his children as responsible and good citizens, and I think he was particularly proud that the kids eventually earned 5 bachelor's and 2 master's degrees. Dad was always focused on family and the future. He was loved by his children and later grandchildren, and we all enjoyed his visits, especially holidays in those latter years. He was always a student by nature and continued to learn throughout his life. He was still reading history books and keeping up with politics and the world right up to the end of his life. And starting with himself, several of the families served honorably in the U.S. military. Dad, Lisa, Jack, and Tanya in the Army, Don and Bob in the Navy, and Larry as a Marine. I'm going to end this history as I muse a few moments about the 7 generations from Abraham down through my dad. America gave Abraham and his family prospects for a new beginnings in the New World. And that continued generation after generation, from Teagarden's Delight in Maryland down through those sod huts of the Nebraska homesteaders to our homes of today. Each generation suffered hardships, poverty, disease and injuries, war, Indian attacks, severe weather, and the worst of all, an unrelenting search for food. But it's also true that each generation benefited by the perseverance and struggles of the previous ones. And when we moved to Montana, many of those promises became a realization for our Montana family. And as I think about all of that history, That is what came before. I'll just finally end this history completely with this family photo in Red Lodge, Montana, 1946. I was very sick that day. It was just after Christmas. I was 6 years old, and we had just come from Margie's house where I had eaten too much candy. I had a terrible stomach ache. Dorothy was a sixth grader, I believe. Marge was teaching in a little country school near Red Lodge. Jack was 14 and living at home. Mary Jane was 18, probably just out of high school, and maybe on her own. Betty had married recently. Don had just got home from the Navy, and Bob was still in high school too and living at home. The future looked bright for us all, and a lot of that optimism was due to, yes, the previous generations of the Teegardens, but particularly to what Mom and Dad provided for us. Dad died in 1962 at age 69 and is buried at Custer National Battlefield near Hardin, Montana. Our mother died in 1984, age 84, and is buried in Red Lodge Cemetery. And surely this story of our family wouldn't be complete without an acknowledgement of what Mom did to making our family healthy, happy, and forward-looking, again during some of the most difficult years of raising children in American history. But as the saying goes, that's another story.